So let's look a little bit more at this idea of functional harmony. What does that term mean? It describes music that's organized in terms of keys, of tonal centers, where the triads contained in the key work in some sort of hierarchy, where chord 1 is the center and other chords in the key kind of gravitate towards that center. So 5 really strongly wants to move to chord 1. Chord 7 is kind of a softer version of 5, so it's on that same sort of circle with 5, pointing towards, gravitating towards 1. And then slightly further out, if you're thinking about a kind of planetary gravitational thing, chords 2 and chord 4 like to move to chord 5 or chord 7, which in turn like to move to chord 1. So there's kind of this inwards motion from the weakest kind of chords in terms of their gravitational pull to chord 1. So like for example, chord 3 doesn't have a very strong gravitational pull to 1 because it has 2 overlapping notes with chord 1, whereas chord 5 has a very strong feeling of wanting to resolve to chord 1. So we're going to look at that a little bit more closely now. So I've spoken now a bit about the idea of different degrees of gravitational pull that chords within a major or minor key have towards chord 1. I think it's helpful now just to go through and revise the names that we give to the chords that we build on each degree of the scale. So we'll have a look at these just now. So these are the tonic for chord 1, supertonic for chord 2, mediant for chord 3, subdominant for chord 4, dominant for chord 5, submediant for chord 6, and leading tone triad for chord 7. If you don't know this already, it's important to use Roman numerals in lowercase and uppercase to reflect whether triads are major or minor or diminished or augmented in quality. So for major chords, we use uppercase Roman numerals. We also use uppercase for augmented triads if you happen to see one of those, but that's unlikely. Lowercase Roman numerals are used for labeling minor triads and also diminished triads or chords. Keep in mind that when you use a diminished labeling, you'll also add a little circle. There you can see in the picture on screen to show that the leading tone triad that you find on the 7th degree of a major scale is in fact a diminished triad. Okay, so that's our Roman numeral labeling. Let's compare the qualities of the triads within major keys to those in minor keys. If we look here at the example of chords in G minor, we see that chord 1 is a minor triad. Chord 2, because of the E flat there, is a diminished chord. So compare that with chord 2 in a major key, which would be a minor chord. Chord 3 in G minor is actually a major triad. Chord 4 in a minor key is minor. Chord 5 in minor keys we should spend a moment looking at because when you're dealing with chord 5 as a kind of a cadential chord, it's important to raise the leading tone. So normally if you don't do anything, if you don't add any accidentals or raise the leading tone, you get a minor, you get D minor as a triad in G minor. So in the example we show you here, it's a D major chord because we've raised that F to F sharp. F sharp is the leading tone in G minor. Chord 6 in G minor is a major triad. It's an E flat major chord. And chord 7 again with the raised leading tone is a diminished chord. Okay, so those are the chords within G minor. So just to summarize there, when you're building triads in minor scales, there are 2 triads that are normally minor, which are chords 1 and 4. There are 3 triads which are normally major. These are chord 3, chord 5, and chord 6. There are two triads which are normally diminished, chord 2 and chord 7, and chord 5 normally is major because you're using the raised leading tone, and chord 7 is normally diminished again because you'll normally use the raised leading tone. So let's think now a bit more about how we go about making chord progressions in a key. What works well? If we're aiming to build towards a cadence, either an imperfect cadence, which is chords 1 to 5, or a perfect cadence, chord 5 to 1. What chords do you put before that to make a phrase? The circle of fifths plays a large part in underpinning successful chord progressions in tonal music. So here is the circle of fifths. Chord 1, chord 4, chord 7, chord 3, chord 6, chord 2, chord 5, chord 1. So there is the perfect cadence at the end of the circle of fifths, right? Preceded by chord 2, 2, 5, 1. So that's inbuilt. 2, 5, 1, 5, 1. 2, 5, 1 built there into the circle of fifths. Let's think about common tones between chords, because chord 2 is very similar to chord 4. So chord 2, when in key of C major, has D, F and A. Chord 4 is an F chord, has F, A and C. There are two common tones between D minor and F major. So actually, they're very similar. You think about a D minor chord in first inversion, so just take your D up to the top. If you just move that D down to C, you've got chord 4. Listen to how similar they are. Okay, so you could make the same cadence really using chord 4. It's very similar to chord 2, 5, 1. Okay, so they have a similar function or a similar role, and that's what we can see down there in the diagram on our handouts and on the screen here. Chord 2 boxed in the same box with chord 4. Similarly, chord 5 shares two common tones with chord 7. So chord 5, G, B, D. If you think about chord 7, it's B, D, F. So B and D are common between chord 5 and chord 7. And if you make a chord 5-7, the dominant sevenths, it actually contains both chord 5 and the notes of chord 7, G, B, D, F. So that's why we've put chord 5 in the same box as chord 7, because they have a similar function, a similar role. It's just that chord 7 is a little less strong if you're wanting to resolve to chord 1. Chord 5 has a stronger final feel to it. But this is interesting when we come to think about substitutions, because you can easily substitute chord 2 for chord 4, and you can substitute chord 5 for chord 7 because they have the same functions. So it's possible to represent those functions in this gravitational kind of way. So with these concentric circles here, with 1 in the center, chord 5 and 7 orbiting immediately around chord 1, then chords 2 and 4 orbiting around the chord 5 and 7, and then further out with a less strong pull to chord 1 than these other chords is chord 6. So there's chord 6. If we just went to chord 2, 5, 1, that's starting to make a nice strong progression, isn't it? And in actual fact, there are two common tones between chord 6 and chord 1. C and E are in common between chord 6 and chord 1. So they have a kind of overlapping function, and that's actually how the interrupted cadence works. So chord 5 normally goes to chord 1. If you instead go to chord 6, it's a kind of substitution. So we've got as far as thinking about chord 2 or chord 4 moving to chord 5, or chord 7 moving to chord 1. And this is actually like a really foundational set of chords. You could write whole pieces just circulating that pattern of chords. But it's nice to broaden things out. So chord 6 we think of as having a kind of a further out gravitational pull. It doesn't lead strongly to chord 1. And if you think about the circle of fifths, it leads well in terms of bass line to chord 2 because it's a fifth above chord 2. The A is a fifth higher than D. So that's why it's represented there, further out beyond chords 2 and chords 4. And then at the outmost concentric ring, we have chord 3. Again, it has 2 notes in common with chord 1. So thinking about the way that chords feel like they pull or progress forwards from 2 to 5, from 5 to 1, this is something we can talk about as progression. So when you see these sorts of chord changes happening, it can be helpful to identify that. We don't need to do this all the time. It's more just in the early stages to drill in this concept of forward motion. It's helpful to do this sort of labeling. And then if you step backwards away from chord 1, that's termed retrogression. So if you went from chord 5 to chord 2, that's a kind of backwards motion. So normally you want to go to chord 1 after chord 5. So if you went to chord 2 after chord 5, it's a backward step. It still can be musically effective, but that's what's happening in a functional way. You're moving away from the center. And then if you stay on the same circle, if you went from chord 2 to chord 4, chord 2 to chord 4, that's a kind of same motion because you're sticking around on the same orbiting ring. So a couple of very basic successful chord progressions, which a lot of music is based on, is chord 1, 4, 5, 1, or chord 1, 2, 5, 1. You could write some sort of ground bass piece over either of those progressions and have lots of melodic decoration and variation over the top of that, but that would be your basic chord progression going round and round and round. Some retrogression and repetition can be successful. Like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. If you had the whole piece taking these backward steps, it may sound like the music's not really going anywhere, is all. But if you think about this progression, this is an example of repetition, chord 1. So one can go anywhere, so that doesn't kind of get labelled. 1, chord 2, chord 4, 5, 1. And then the interrupted cadence, which you may know as being chord 5 going to chord 6. It's like an escape route. Doesn't quite get to the conclusion you think it's going to go to. It doesn't go to chord 1, goes to chord 6. Chord 5 to chord 6. Is a type of retrogression because we're going from 5 back out away from the center if you think about these orbiting rings. So that's a successful kind of and often used form of retrogression. So a little exercise to try here is to label this very famous piece of music using those P, R, and S labels for progression, retrogression, and same for repetition. We're in D major. We can see that we've labelled the key underneath by using an uppercase D, so that means D major. If it were D minor, you'd use a lowercase d with a little colon there. So that's a convention that we want to use when we're doing analysis using this method. So firstly, think about the Roman numerals. But because this is a broken chord kind of pattern, you have to kind of line up the notes to work out what these are. We've got a harmonic rhythm here of 1, one chord per minimum. That's adding up to a D major chord, then to a B minor chord, an E minor chord in first inversion, and then an A7 chord. So D and E minor again in first inversion. So D major is chord 1, so that'd be an uppercase 1. And then we've got the B minor chord. I'm looking at the left hand. B minor chord. E minor is chord 2 in first inversion, and then chord 5. A. Normally A, C sharp, E, and G, but the C sharp is up there in the right hand melody. And then back to chord 1. D. And then chord 2 again, E minor. So I would actually label that all as chord 5 because the F sharp and the D are kind of decorations of chord 5. But I will happily accept if you want to call that chord 1 in second inversion, moving to chord 5, that's fine as well. Chord 6 moving to chord 2 is a kind of progression because it's moving towards the center of our orbiting rings. Chord 2 moving to chord 5 is a progression, so that's a P. Chord 5 to 1 is a progression. And then chord 2 moving to chord 5 is another type of progression. Now for homework, I recommend that you have a go at some of these exercises on the last page. And these are going to help your fluency to develop with using Roman numerals. So the first question there is in G major. We know that this is because it's an uppercase G at the bottom there underneath the bass clef. G major, chord 5, uppercase chord 5. That's going to be a D major chord. Now the question asks you to use accidentals rather than a key signature. So you just need to write D, F sharp and A. So the next question there is in A flat major, chord 3. In A flat major is going to be a C minor triad. So the answer would be C, E flat and G. So here you need to know your key signatures as well. So you need to know that A flat major has 4 flats and that one of the notes in this chord therefore will be an E flat. Okay, so I recommend that you do those for homework, and then on the final page of this handout I'll just demonstrate the first question here. We've got a B flat major triad. In the key of F major that will be chord 4, in the key of D minor that will be chord 6, and in the key of G minor that will be chord 3. In all cases it's going to be uppercase Roman numerals. It's just that where that chord lies in relation to these different tonics will be different. Okay, and here's an example of analysing a chorale by J.S. Bach. So firstly, you name the key. Now how do you work out what key this is in? I recommend that you look at the context, beginning on a B flat major chord and ending on a B flat major chord. And then look at the cadence at the end. We've got an F chord, chord 5 to 1. There's a strong feeling of perfect cadence there, so it ends on a B flat chord. This is going to be in B flat major as opposed to G minor. Okay, so B flat major, uppercase B, and then flat. So therefore your first chord there's a B flat chord, and that's going to be uppercase chord 1. So see how you go with applying your Roman numeral labels to that, but also the progression labeling that we've learned, P, R and S. So the final two questions there, questions 3 and 4, are just exercising you in this idea of progression, different types of progression, retrogression and repetition. So you're asked in the first question there, in the key of D major, from an E minor triad, which would be chord 2, what would produce a progression motion? So moving towards the center. So 2 would move to chord 5 or chord 7. So you could write either chord 5 or 7 there, right? Chord 2 going to chord 5 would be a progression. So you'd have little chord 2 for Roman numeral 2 and then uppercase 5. And the next row of questions are just in the bass clef. So really good exercises there in your use of key signatures.